Every season of the Arrowverse has its own main villain, and while a lot of them are really good, some of them just don't really hit the mark, while there are other villains that maybe could have been better. The Arrowverse also has had a lot of villains who I think could have made for some great villains based off their portrayal on the shows or in their portrayals in the comics, and they just never got the chance to do so. So in this video, I'm going to be going over 10 villains from the Arrowverse who I think could have made for some pretty good villains, either because of their portrayal on the shows, or because based off the comics, you would think that those characters and those villains would be villains of one of the seasons of these shows. So with that in mind, let's start with number 10.
Who the hell is this guy?
In the comics, David Clinton, aka CHRONOS, is an enemy of the Atom and a time traveler, which I think both of those things very much would fit Legends of Tomorrow. Atom is on the cast, it's all about time travel, and while they kind of messed him up on the show, I mean, CHRONOS on the show was Mick Rory, his storyline was so weird, that whole thing was so stupid. I think the comic book version of CHRONOS would have worked so well for a season of Legends of Tomorrow, maybe season 2, 3, 4, it doesn't really matter. I mean, season 2, no, maybe not, because the Legion of Doom were great. Also, Mullis is pretty good, so I think maybe in season 4, CHRONOS could have showed up and been the main villain, but I think either way, CHRONOS definitely should have been the main villain of a season of a time-traveling show starring the Atom, or the Atom's a part of it.
You chose to save 100 people on that train, instead of thousands at the airport. One might deduce that there was someone on that train that you cared about. And finding that person is the key to revealing who you really are.
Supergirl Season 1 is one of the worst seasons of the Arrowverse, and basically every single villain who appeared in the season was very, very bad, including the secondary main villain Astra and the main villain Non, but there was one villain who actually wasn't that bad, and that's Maxwell Lord. Maxwell Lord had a very interesting dynamic with Supergirl, kind of like a Superman Lex Luthor dynamic, which would definitely be copying from Superman, but I mean, the entire show copies a lot from Superman. Supergirl herself was only ever created to be a female version of Superman, so I really don't think that if they had the same dynamic between Supergirl and Maxwell Lord that Superman and Lex Luthor had, I don't think that that would be a bad idea at all, and I think that would have made season 1 a much better season than it ended up being. Maybe not that much better, because the main villain wasn't the only problem, but at least would have had an interesting villain.
So you're the Arrow. Thought you'd be taller.
It's over. Lower your bow and live.
We both know that's not gonna happen.
The Flash has been accused of using way too many speedster main villains, but the same cannot be said for Arrow, and I don't mean speedsters, I mean the equivalent on Arrow, and that is archers. Merlin is really the only archer main villain on Arrow. Prometheus does use a bow and arrow, but it's not his main weapon, so it's really just Merlin, and I think Komodo could have been one of the main villains of the season, considering he is an archer, and considering his role in the comics. On the show, Komodo was used as a one-off villain in one of the episodes of season 3, being accused of murdering Sarah, but then it turns out he didn't, and then we never saw him again, which is a waste because the comic book villain had the potential to be a season-long villain, and it probably would have been pretty cool to see another Archer main villain in one of the seasons. I think season 3 or 4 or 6 or 7, just not 1, 2, or 5, probably would have worked with Komodo, the comic version, not necessarily the show version, being the main villain of that season.
I thought you were looking for Leonard Snart.
Why bother? His reign is over. There's a new king in town.
And I'm the queen. Yeah, I wouldn't be too sure about that.
Oh, I would, little girl.
Mirror Master is one of the few members of the Rogues, or the main members of the Rogues, really the only one who the show didn't do well at all. The actor who played him wasn't very good, his powers were so much less interesting than they could have been, and his role on the show was not very good, which is a huge shame because Mirror Master is one of the only members of the Rogues who I think could make for a good main villain of a season. His abilities could be such an interesting thing to explore, like the mirror world would be such an interesting thing to explore explore in a season where Team Flash actually go in to the Mirror World. Mirror Master could have been the villain of season 3, maybe 4, definitely played by a different actor and definitely very different from the show's version. Also, he would have a costume and a much more interesting storyline, but overall Mirror Master is, I think, one of the few members of the Rogues, and this is because of his abilities that would make for a very interesting season where he is the main villain. The Flash Season 3 was mostly about the consequences of Flashpoint, and for the main consequence, they used Savitar, which worked out well, but also was very convoluted, and the third speedster villain in a row, so who knows, maybe Killer Frost would have worked just as well, maybe even better. Caitlin becoming Killer Frost because of what Barry has done would serve as a great consequence of Flashpoint, but also Frost would be a much more personal main villain than Savitar. Even though Savitar is Barry Allen himself, it wasn't that personal, because it was a version of Barry Allen we never met before. If they used Killer Frost, who used to be Caitlin Snow, a part of the team and one of the best friends of Barry Allen and the rest of Team Flash, I think that would have worked very well for the main consequence of Flashpoint, where Caitlin Snow becomes evil, like full on. This would mean that Killer Frost would never become a superhero, which I really don't have a problem with that. I would much prefer Killer Frost be a full-on villain, a villain of a season, rather than her be a superhero, because her name is Killer Frost and she is a villain in the comics, or at least she was before the Arrowverse came along, so I do think that this would have worked maybe even better than Savitar in Season 3.
That name ring a bell. Oliver Queen. He tried to buy off me last year, just before the Hood put me in a padded cell. Ipso facto, Arrow.
Arrow has had two different versions of Count Vertigo, the Count and Count Vertigo, and while neither of them I don't think would have served as the great main villain of a season, I used a clip for the Count because he's a much better character, and even though he was less comic accurate, he had a much better rivalry with the Green Arrow, or the Arrow, or even the Hood actually, back in seasons 1 and 2, but I think that neither of them would have served as a great main villain. It's the comic book villain, the Count Vertigo, who I think would have made a great main villain for a season. Now, Green Arrow does not have a very big rogues gallery, certainly not enough to fill up 7 seasons of a television show, which is why they used so many villains from other heroes, like Deathstroke in Season 2, Ra's al Ghul in Season 3, and Damien Dark in Season 4, as well as a lot of villains of the week or recurring villains over the course of the show. But considering Count Vertigo is essentially the arch enemy of the Green Arrow along with Merlin, but both of them are the main villains of the Green Arrow, it's very surprising to me that considering they had so many seasons to fill up and they used so many villains from other heroes, the fact that they never used Count Vertigo as the main villain of a season is definitely very surprising. Vertigo's vertigo-inducing powers would have served as a much better foil to the Green Arrow than Damien Dark's powers. Damien Dark's abilities made it so that Green Arrow couldn't move, while Vertigo's powers would make him very disoriented. But just imagining a scene where Green Arrow powers through that Count Vertigo's abilities, which is not something he could do with Damien Dark's abilities without getting powers himself, which was stupid, that would have made for such an awesome scene with Count Vertigo. I think Count Vertigo should have been the main villain of Arrow Season 4, and not the Count or Count Vertigo from the shows, but a much more comic accurate version of the character with the same powers, the same background, and the same storyline, which is very surprising that considering he's one of the arch enemies of the Green Arrow, they never used him as the main villain of any of the seasons, which I think they should have.
Yes, I am a god. The god of speed.
Go, go, go!
GODSPEED is one of, if not the coolest looking enemy of the Flash in the comics, and although he is very new to the comics, only debuting in 2016, he managed to become one of the most famous Flash villains in that short amount of time, mostly because of how cool he looks, but also because his storyline is very interesting. It's a storyline that is already built to be a very good storyline for a season of the Flash, a storyline that could make a very personal main villain for the Flash. GODSPEED, August Hart, was a friend of Barry Allen. villain who later became a hero named GODSPEED, but later he became a villain as GODSPEED, and I think that could have worked so well for a season of The Flash. Now he's only appeared in one episode as a villain of the week in the future, and although he is returning as a different character, I think they already wasted GODSPEED. I mean, in Season 3 at the end, there was a Speed Force storm, which is exactly how GODSPEED got his powers in the comics. That could have set up the GODSPEED storyline in Season 4, and although I don't think they should have done 4 speedsters in a row, that could have set up GODSPEED to be the main villain of Season 5, which, let's be honest, it would 100% would have been better than either Cicada or Cicada version 2.
I did what I had to do to keep Earth together and to stay alive. I became what I had to become. You ask why I changed? That is it.
The KGBEAST is not a Green Arrow villain, he's a part of the Batman Rogues Gallery, which is why going into a Green Arrow TV show, you wouldn't expect the KGBEAST to be this high on a list like this, but I think the way he was used on the show certainly made him a part of Oliver's life and the story, and while it didn't seem like Anatoly would ever be a villain, Season 5 did a very good job at setting him up as a villain, which, along with basically everything else that Season 5 set up, Season 6 ruined and squandered, as Anatoly was a part of the secondary main villain team, where he wasn't even the leader of that team. It's a huge shame because Anatoly is just a much better character than Caden James and Diaz. With all the build-up and how personal he is to Oliver, Season 6 I think would have been so much better if Anatoly Knyazov became the KGBEAST he is in the comics and was the main villain of the season. Gorilla Grodd is one of the most iconic and famous villains in the Flash's Rogues Gallery, and Grodd himself, along with Gorilla City, would have made for such an interesting location and character to explore, as Gorilla Grodd is a very interesting character who could have made for a great season of The Flash. Realistically, Grodd being the main villain of a season isn't possible, as to have Grodd in 23 episodes, or even anywhere near that amount of episodes, it's just way too expensive. That's the main reason he's never been the main villain of a season. It's also the reason he's never really appeared for more than like one episode, and on Let's Go Tomorrow Season 3 they managed to have him in a couple episodes, and I don't know how they did that, but they wouldn't really be able to have him in every single episode, especially if you have to have other gorillas from Gorilla City. But in an ideal world, Gorilla Grodd I think would definitely have been the main villain of a season of a Flash TV show, and for the actual show I think Season 2 would have worked, pushing Zoom and the multiverse to Season 3 and pushing the Flashpoint consequences to Season 4, and if not a season, I think Gorilla Grodd should have been the main villain of a crossover. There was a short, the second Fight Club, with the characters, and that kind of a little bit teased Gorilla Grodd being the villain of a crossover. I think Gorilla Grodd really would have worked, maybe as the villain instead of Vandal Savage of Heroes Join Forces, making Heroes Join Forces a lot better than it ended up being. But even without the actual Arrowverse continuity, the fact that a Flash TV show doesn't have Gorilla Grodd as one of the main villains definitely makes sense because of how it would just be way too expensive. But again, in an ideal world, he definitely would be the villain of a season.
I could speed you to my own private prison where you'll never see the light of day.
You could, but then I won't be around to stop my own private uplink that'll broadcast your identity to the world. So, the million-dollar question. What to do with me now, Barry Allen?
Before the show made the Reverse Flash as popular as he is, Captain Cold was definitely the most famous Flash villain, along with the Rogues, characters like Heatwave, Weather Wizard, Golden Glider, the Trickster, Pied Piper, and also Mirror Master and Captain Boomerang. But looking back on the show, the characters from Season 1 that could have made a great Rogues Gallery, or the Rogues, Captain Cold, Heatwave, Weather Wizard, Golden Glider, Trickster, and Pied Piper, which I think could have made for a good Season 2. Now, there wasn't really ever an opportunity looking back now for them to be the main villain. As Season 1, I do not think they could have done it any differently than what they did with Reverse Flash. It was perfect. Season 2, Captain Cold already started becoming a villain, or a good guy, joining the Legends, not really having much of a role in the season aside from Weather Wizard breaking him out of prison. But I think that, again, just like Gorilla Grodd, the fact that a Flash TV show never had Captain Cold and the Rogues as one of the main villains definitely is a little bit weird, considering Captain Cold, Gorilla Grodd, and the Reverse Flash are the three main villains, main antagonists of the Flash, it's very weird to me that only one of them has ever been the main villain. So while looking back, there was never an opportunity. Captain Cold and the Rogues definitely should have been the main villain of one of the seasons, and even if he wasn't the main villain, he definitely should have been a secondary main villain. Although he appeared in a number of episodes in season 1, I think it would have been cool if the first 7 episodes of the season leading up to the crossover and then Reverse Flash takes over, if in those 7 episodes Captain Cold and the Rogues came together and were the villain or the villains of all 7 episodes instead of just being villains of the week every single episode, and then Captain Cold is in one of them. I think that would have been pretty cool, but Captain Cold and the Rogues definitely should have been the villains of one season of a Flash TV show, and I think that is the case for Captain Cold more so than any villain in the Arrowverse. And also, not to mention, in the actual show, Captain Cold had a very good rivalry with the Flash in season 1. So those are the 10 villains in the Arrowverse who I think should have been villains of an entire season. Let me know in the comments down below what you think of this list, what you would change about it, and what villains you think I missed and should have been villains of a season, and I didn't talk about them in this video. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below, and if you like this video, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe, and thanks for watching.